edition of Michigan Nature Bites. My name is Evan, and you might see kind of walking back and forth across the camera. This is Beaker, the Sandhill Crane. Now, we've had to adjust the studio a little bit to make accommodations for this absolutely amazing bird, who is the second tallest species in North America. The tallest species being the endangered whooping crane, but she is a very special crane because we don't normally get a chance to go out on programs with them because they are not easily transported. Obviously, kind of tucking up those legs becomes a little challenging, but she is a mal-imprinted bird, and she was found in somebody's backyard. They had kind of been, she'd been coming up and was in a park, and she was coming up and she was soliciting attention. So that's one of the reasons we know that she was mal-imprinted, and actually pickpocketing people. So she is very, very curious, and will look at everything from like my ponytail holder to my keys to any sort of fun thing that kind of pops up onto the ground. And when the person that found her finally was able to, determine that we wanted to bring her here with us, she just hopped right in the back of their car. So Beaker's not too much of a stranger to people, which is great for us, but in the wild, that's not really the best situation for her. Now, our theme today for Michigan Nature Bites, this tidbit of knowledge that we are going to go over, is all about things that you might find in wetlands. So, well, first of all, that behavior, if you've seen any of our programs before, do you remember what it is when a bird takes their beak and runs it through their feathers? We've talked about it before, but one, it's a sign of comfort. So she's finally comfortable enough in the studio to kind of make sure all of her feathers are in place. But it is called preening. So she is preening her feathers to make them all nice and pretty so that she can present her best self. Now, when it comes to wetlands, Michigan is was mostly wetlands. So before pre-colonization, about 70% of the state was wetlands. And now, anyone have a guess as to how much of the state is still functional wetland? And it's a pretty shocking number. So 15% of the state is now wetland. And that's a huge reduction in habitat for animals like Beaker and our other animal that we're going to meet a little bit later called a Blanding's turtle. And these wetland habitats are not just important to the wildlife, but they're also really important for us as people because they're one of the best ways to control things like flooding and runoff and ground stabilization, because they have these really great kind of essentially like a built-in water system where they can raise and lower the temperature, or not the temperature, the water level, and it stays nice and it's able to absorb it so that we don't end up with flooding and things like that. So the more that we remove these wetlands, the more prone to flooding like these new neighborhoods and things are that go up. And when the snow melts in the spring and it doesn't have anywhere to go, it runs into yards and other places that it's not really all that great for. But there are 4 types of wetlands in Michigan. Does anybody know what those 4 types are? Give you just a second. We've got bogs, fens, marshes, and swamps. And each one of those has a unique kind of characteristic about them that makes them a special habitat for different types of animals. So birds like Beaker are in the wading bird category, and so if we look at her long legs that kind of look like dinosaur legs, if you get up close and personal with them, those are nice and long so that she can wade in the water and keep herself nice and dry. So she is, would be strutting around in the wetland areas and is going to be using that long beak to kind of dig down into the dirt, where she's going to go for things like, crustaceans and grubs and other, shake it all out, and grubs and other things like that for the carnivorous side of it. They're actually omnivores, so you might find them in places like cornfields, where you start to see things like them kind of picking up, especially this time of year post-harvest, because they'll pick up all the extra corn kernels that they see out on the ground. So unfortunately, this can mean that they don't often migrate as soon as they should because they feel like they have a stable food source. So they are migrators, and that's part of how they got their name. So Sandhill Cranes got their name because they migrate and gather in the largest numbers in the sandhills of Nebraska. And there are thousands and thousands of them at one time. So like I said, she's very curious about what's going on. So now that she's really kind of coming into her own and becoming more comfortable in the studio, she's feeling more like she can start exploring some of these novel items that she's never seen before. But their name, again, comes from the fact that they migrate through the sandhills, and they migrate all the way down to Florida. And one of the things that we see most commonly here in our clinic when it comes to injuries with our Sandhill Cranes is actually not mal-imprinting, which is what happened to Beaker, but we see wing injuries because these birds don't really have a lot of natural predators in the wild. So they're very kind of blasé about walking across the road and things like that. So they're often either hit by cars or come in conflict with other moving vehicles. And so here's where you can help us out and help out these amazingly beautiful creatures that we see as part of our state flora and fauna. So if you see a crane and its wing is kind of drooping down a little bit, chances are that wing is either damaged in some way or maybe even so far as broken. Now birds have hollow bones to be able to fly. And when a hollow bone is broken, it knits itself back together really quickly. And so if it knits itself back together in a way that isn't the way that it's supposed to be, it can actually cause permanent long-term deformities in their wings that we can't even fix here in our nature center, in our rehab clinic. So those animals end up having to find forever homes. So if you see a crane on the side of the road with a drooping wing, please give us a call sooner rather than later so we can get out there and help them. All right, so any questions about Beaker, our Sandhill Crane ambassador that we've met today, before we move to our second animal? Okay, so we'll let Beaker kind of continue to move herself around the studio, and we'll just let her continue to explore while we go over here to our next animal. And now, oops, it's just going to take me a second. These are apparently Evan-proof. All right. So I have kept our next friend very warm and toasty because she is a juvenile Blanding's turtle. And if you have never heard of Blanding's turtles before, they are threatened here in the state of Michigan. So they are a really rare species and almost live exclusively in bogs. Now, like we talked about earlier, each habitat of those four has a different kind of unique aspect to it. And for bogs, they're really acidic, so they are a nice habitat for our Blanding's turtles. Now, she is less than a couple of years old. She's very, very new, but she could end up living to be about 80 years old. And what's really incredible is that, one, they don't start reaching sexual maturity until they're about 12 to 15. So it's part of the reason why these amazing little turtles are struggling in their population numbers the way that they are. And so when they're this tiny, it's really easy for them to get smushed trying to cross roadways or get eaten or picked off by other animals. But if they can reach that sexual maturity and if they can start breeding, these animals actually don't have any signs of visible aging. So once a Blanding's turtle is at full-grown stage, they really won't age for the rest of their lives and can actually breed up until their 80s. So for about 8 to 9 decades, they can continue to breed. So if we can get them to the point where they are able to be released out into sexual maturity, then they've got a pretty good chance of continuing to add to the population. Now, our tiny little friend here, we would not be keeping with us unless there was a reason. So we're gonna take a really close look and we're gonna see if we can get the camera to focus on her. But her eyes have cataracts on them, causing her to be completely blind. So oh, there we go. Now she'll poke her head out a little bit more. But her eyes, because they have the kind of milky coloration over top of them, prevent her from being able to see. And they are omnivores, and in the wild, they use the watery part of wetlands to swim around and look for things like crustaceans, tiny little fish, and other sort of aquatic invertebrates. And so without the ability to see, our friend Emmy here, named for their scientific name, Emmy blandingii. It's tough to say Latin names. It's a dead language. They're not really meant to be said out loud. But Emmy is going to be living with us for the rest of her hopefully very long life. Now these, like I said, are a species of concern in Michigan. And one of the things that you can do to help is, be a voice for wetlands. It's absolutely ridiculous that we only have 15% of the wetlands still left in the state. And so for creatures like Emmy or Beaker, those are really important for their well-being, and we could be losing species that are really important for us too. So a creature like the Blandings turtle that has this amazing scientific miracle that they don't really age is something that we haven't really had a chance to study very much as people. So who knows what knowledge is being lost when we lose this habitat and these species that we haven't even fully come to understand yet. Now I know our nature bites are normally a little bit more upbeat and happy than that, but wetlands are such a critical part of us here at Michigan that it would be crazy to not talk about them and to not talk about the amazing animals that live there. So any questions that we have about wetlands or our two friends that we met today?
How do we know that Emmy is a female?
So if we take a look at the underside of her, what's called a carapace, so right here, the shape of her carapace is nearly completely flat. If she were a male Blandings turtle, it would be a little bit more concave like this, and that helps with reproduction. So that's how we know that Emmy is a girl.
How big do Blandings get?
They'll get to be somewhere between 7 inches and about 10 inches, so I'm holding on to her so I can't really make the great shape, but they'll end up being about this big. Sorry, we'll try to make that a little bit easier to see.
How did she get found?
Now, I'm not entirely sure where they ended up finding her, but there were, a member of the public, they found her, they recognized her as a Blandings turtle and in a location that she wasn't supposed to be. So they brought her into us, and we were able after a while to, after watching her behaviors and investigating the state of her eyes, we were able to discover that she is not able to see. All right, so thank you all for tuning in. Like I said, we're going to be doing these every week, so next week we're going to do a new topic, and what's really cool about the Michigan Nature Bites and being virtual is that we're able to meet some of the animals that we don't normally get to take out on programs. So if you enjoyed this wetlands program today and you want to book a virtual program, you can also have Beaker come visit your classroom virtually instead of our normal lineup that we see in person. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed this little bite